Welcome to the Sourcing Industry Landscape Podcast, powered by SIG.org and hosted by Dawn Tura.
Well, I am so excited, you guys, to welcome Joe Adamski. He's the Senior Director of Procurability, and he's joining me in the studio today. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Dawn. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
So Joe has a very interesting background. If you don't know him, he has more than 12 years of advisory and consulting experience in strategic procurement and large-scale transformation. Earlier in his career, he was an Air Force pilot before joining A.T. Kearney and their consumer practice. He's consulted with numerous Fortune 500 companies in a variety of industries, including utilities, CPGs, or consumer packaged good companies, grocery, retail, telecom, apparel, food and beverage, and government. He also has a BS in physics from the United States Air Force Academy. Congratulations. And an MBA from Emory Universities. And I don't know how to say it. Goizueta. He also enjoys boating, hiking, and spending time outdoors. So, Joe, what a great background you have. And I think you're the first one with a degree in physics that I've ever had on the podcast.
Well, it's good to know.
Yeah, it's a little bit different. But before we get started, we're going to take a quick break for a word from our sponsor. When we return, we're going to hear from our guest, Joe Adamski.
Sourcing Industry Group, or SIG, is the premier global sourcing association and is widely known as a forum for providing thought leadership, networking, and training opportunities. SIG is unique as it provides these opportunities to a blend of executives and practitioners in sourcing, procurement, risk, and outsourcing, as well as the service providers and advisors who serve them. SIG provides you with unrivaled networking opportunities with its global events program. These include summits, signature events, CPO and executive virtual series, and webinars. Another one of SIG's core elements is that of thought leadership. Our members are at the forefront of the industry and are driving innovation in all aspects of sourcing, procurement, and third-party risk. This intel is available across all of SIG's offerings. Another central element of SIG is training. SIG is the parent organization for SIG University and offers one-of-a-kind certification and training programs for professionals seeking deep expertise in sourcing, governance, risk, intelligent automation, and more for themselves and for their teams. You can learn more about all of these offerings on the SIG website or by reaching out to one of our representatives. So make sure to take advantage of all that SIG has to offer for both members and non-members alike, because there really is something for everyone.
Well, welcome back, Joe. I wanted to talk to you because you had an amazing presentation at the last summit, and you talked a lot about equipment shortages, and we know supply chains are disrupted. For example, electrical transformers. And having spent so many years myself consulting to utilities, our electrical grid relies on electrical transformers to function, and securing those transformers is critical to ensure grid safety and to drive growth. So what are you doing when they become unavailable?
Well, every utility in the country starts having to scramble. It's an interesting situation to get into. I mean, the supply chain disruptions are something that has affected every industry, every company out there in varying degrees. But when in the particular case of transformers, what they found is it's almost a perfect storm. So you have the demand side of the equation that was impacted because developers didn't necessarily know what was going to happen with new housing starts or where people were going to want to move to. So they were pulling back a little bit on some of their plans and weren't really willing to commit to things. You had the shift of where people wanted to live because of the rise of teleworking. So certain municipalities that didn't necessarily have high growth plans built in, all of a sudden found themselves epicenters where people were willing to relocate from some of the larger cities to because of the quality of life, lower cost of living, whatever it happened to be. So all of a sudden you had planning that was disrupted, and then you had an influx of people that was unanticipated. So all of a sudden the demand side of the equation went crazy wrong. On the supply side of the equation, you had these massive delays that started getting built into the system. So you had demands that maybe would give you 6 months worth of information to say how far out was it that before the developers were going to need these transformers to be installed in order to be able to electrify a house. And obviously you can't live in a house if it doesn't have electricity.
Right.
But then on the supply side, you had lead times for these items going from where they were 3 to 6 months pre-pandemic to a year and a half, 2 years.
Oh my
depending
goodness.
on certain items. And it's crazy, and it's still that bad today. And everyone is scrambling, trying to find where they can get sources of supply. So different companies have solved it in different ways. Some have been able to lock in production slots with some of the providers, and so they know they're going to get a steady stream. It may not be enough, but they know they're going to get a steady stream of product being shipped in. Others have started to look further afield. They're looking at manufacturers in Europe. They're looking at manufacturers in Mexico, in Korea. All of that is trying to find alternative sources of supply that will work with their existing electrical grid, will work with the other items that are in the electrical grid without too much significant modification, but everything that's necessary for them to be able to continue to provide services so they can continue to support the growth within those communities.
So, boy, the follow on effect of not having transformers means that homes can be built, but they can't be electrified.
Mm-hmm.
So, which means the developers are holding out that much longer until they're going to be able to sell these properties. And
Mm-hmm.
all the building material is also disrupted. I mean, it is like a perfect storm because so correct me if I'm wrong, but transformers from one utility to another are not necessarily transferable. Is that correct?
They are largely fungible, but there are nuances to that, right? The way there, maybe you get down to the actual connection that's being used. There's some how it plugs into the grid. There's some differences with the equipment that's used with that. But the other piece of it is that it's the size of the transformers that may not be transferable, right? You
Mm.
can always put a larger device into an installation from what you need, but you can't put a smaller device. So
That's
if
what
you're
causes
building
them
out your
to blow.
plans, I'm sorry.
That's what causes them to blow, right?
Yes, because
Okay.
you'll overload them. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So so in emergencies, do utilities keep a lot of transformers on hand? Because it seems like a transformer blows somewhere all the time.
Yes, so utilities will keep a certain amount of stock on hand under their normal operational levels from an O&M perspective. They also all will do what they'll call gray sky or storm or the different
Mhm.
appellations for it. But they work with their suppliers to make sure that there's an alternative source of supply. And when a utility is under a declaration where there's been that kind of an emergency where they need the help, the suppliers prioritize those utilities in order to be able to get them the items that they need. There's also across all utilities, there's a mutual aid agreement that's been put in place where
Oh,
they will help each other to be able to recover from things like that. So it's a good system because everyone recognizes that a failure in one area will have ramifications everywhere else, and it's in all of the utilities' interest, given the way the industry is structured and with what they're trying to provide in terms of this very critical service to all of us. They will help each other to get everything stood back up, at least while there's a declaration of an emergency for it.
yeah. It seems that there are emergencies happening all over the country, though, at the same time, because we have wildfires in one place, we've got tornadoes in another, we've got hurricane season coming up.
Mm-hmm.
So as you're working and with procurement, and as they mature and their supply chain disruptions are amplified and persist, talk about how they're trying to move from a processor towards influencer, and describe what processor and influencer are and why it's so critical.
Sure. What it is that when you have these supply chain disruptions, procurement has to be able to step up their role and be more of a strategic partner to their business partners. They can't just be order takers, and they
Yeah.
can't just look at things that were done historically and say, well, we used to order 100 a month, so we're just going to keep ordering 100 a month of this particular SKU, and we did 50 of this other SKU, and so we're just going to keep doing that. The planners are getting creative as they recognize it's a give and take within the system. They're doing things differently because they're seeing what supply is available. Procurement, if they're not aware of that, might be ordering based on old patterns, old practices, old habits, and then the two things don't match. So procurement has to step up their role and really have that seat at the table to be aware of what the business is doing as a whole and helping to influence what the business is doing as a whole, because they're looking at it from a supply perspective. If they're starting to make plans to say that we need to do everything with a 75 kilovolt kVA, kilovolt amp hour transformers, but they know that they can't get those, then it's a question of, okay, can we start working with you to figure out how can we do this with other alternative SKUs, alternative items things that we can supply and that can meet the needs. But it's a little bit of a give and take, and it's a bit of a tightrope to walk, because procurement with these long lead times is having to make decisions now about what to order. So what do they have in the warehouse come a year, 18 months, 24 months from now that may or may not actually match what is needed in order to be put out into the field. So it's a fine line, but the more information that procurement can get and the more they can help to provide a perspective and try to guide the planners and try to guide the overall development that they're facing in order to be able to make use of what supply they can get is going to be critical. But that's, at the end of the day, that is what procurement needs to evolve towards across the board, is being able to demonstrate that they are not just order takers. They're not a bureaucracy. They're not just in the way to say, you need to order a box of pencils, but you got to justify why you need them. That's not procurement's role when it comes down to this. What procurement's role is at the end of the day is to say, I understand that you need to procure goods and services in order to be able to function as a business. And procurement's job is to make sure that that's there so that the business can function, can execute its mission while being compliant with any applicable laws and regulations, but doing all of that in the most efficient and effective manner possible. And that is a hard line to walk.
Yeah. So I was wondering, have the new weather patterns, or I guess not patterns, has the weather disruption caused further supply chain disruptions that weren't predicted before for the utilities?
So, knock on wood, this is predicted to be a relatively light hurricane season this year. So hopefully there won't be much of an impact. We've had, as I'm aware of, one tropical storm or one tropical depression actually formed in the Gulf already and then quickly dissipated, which is a good thing. They're not expecting a lot of named storms this year. So it hopefully gives the supply chain an opportunity to catch up. When you have massive storms that have gone through, which we have had in the last 5-10 years, those are things that do create that undue stress on the system, because it's an exogenous event that just, while it's predictable in a certain sense, the actual size of it and where they're going to hit, because it can make a huge difference. A couple of miles shift left or right with where that comes ashore, it goes from being catastrophic to nothing. And that is incredibly difficult to be able to predict and account for. And there's always an element of luck that comes into it. I mean, Florida always bears the brunt of those things. You look at Fort Myers is still trying to recover from the storms that happened last fall, and will continue. It'll take years, I think, for them to really get everything back up to where it was beforehand. But then you look at some of the other areas, and they didn't bear anything from it.
Yeah.
So it is going to vary. But as far as the severity of the storms, that is really what's going to be an open question. And I think the real impact that comes in is, even if the storms themselves don't become more severe, they're hitting areas that have become more dense and more populous. And so the nature of the impact from the storm just gets magnified because of that.
Yeah. So what are they doing to manage supply chain disruptions? Can you sort of share, are they doing a good job? How are they adapting?
I think most utilities are still figuring it out. If you look at the traditional utilities, they're not exactly in a fast-moving industry. Yeah. Things are generally pretty predictable. It takes many years for them to build new infrastructure. When you get down to the consumer-facing piece, specifically what we're talking about with these transformers, where you're looking at getting them into individual homes to support things, that's probably about the fastest-moving piece of what they deal with. And traditionally, that's been very, very stable. These are well-engineered items that don't have a high degree of change. You look at some of the installed base of things that are out there, they were built 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and they're still in use. And there are still repair parts available for those things because they're still being produced, because what's modern and what was done in the past, they're not that different. So you're able to use the right parts to do things. So, utilities have been very, very stable. Then you have COVID come in. Then you have all of the disruptions of getting things through the ports. Then you have everything that's happened in terms of even some of the supply disruptions that are happening. And even there's government action taking place to try to change the materials that they're using, the type of steel that they're using in some of the transformers. That is all combining to drive a significant amount of disruption and these lead times going crazy. So every utility is facing the issue of that they have to do something different. And so they're trying different things. one of the things that's most important is I think is being able to build out the right types of models to get in front of this. You have data. You're able to look at things from a demand perspective. You're able to look at things from a supply perspective, bring those together to be able to, fundamentally look at what do you have on hand? When do you need to order? How much do you need to order? Building those types of models that can be predictive, can take into account seasonality, can take into account what various providers can actually give you, whether, whatever commodity it is that you're talking about. All of those are important to start doing planning. Now, there's material planners that are out there that are in some other industries, and they're saying, well, that's table stakes. That's something we've been doing all along. Yes, when you have industries that are faster moving, that's something that's important. But for the utility space, that's a new territory that they're having to figure out, and they're having to walk. And so they're getting in front of that. The next thing that they're doing is restructuring themselves organizationally to be able to better serve their internal customers and the external marketplace that they need to be able to support. So that's getting the right organization in place and putting in the right types of category management, putting in the right types of sourcing professionals who can get in front of some of these things, but really restructuring the organization to be able to move faster, to be a little bit more nimble, but also to push themselves to be able to take advantage of where they see opportunities within the supply chain, but at the same time, building a backbone that's going to make sure they have what they need when they need it.
Interesting. So I don't know if you know, Joe, but probably, 15, 18 years ago, I sourced transformers for Southern California Edison, and it was one of my favorite categories of all. It was so interesting. But, you had to deal with engineers who would just say stuff like, people will die if you make me change my specification. Are engineers still sometimes difficult to work with?
I've worked with some really great engineers who are very flexible, who understand that there's things that happen off of a blueprint that you have to adjust. Generally, the ones who have worked in the field and they understand the idea of field modifications that are going to happen. And then you get others that it's very much, no, this is what we've planned, this is what we have to do. And I understand that perspective as well, because it's a complicated system that they're building. And if you make small changes in one place, that's going to cascade through the system and may have unintended consequences. So the position that they take, absolutely valid. The concept, though, of we can't do anything because we don't know what will happen in this day and age today, in the world that we live in, that can't be the answer. So there is a bit of a learning curve that has to happen with everybody about how can we adjust what we're doing in order to make this more effective.
So the other thing that I clearly remember is that every time I had a cross-functional team, I literally had hundreds of years of experience on that team. That, people go to utilities and at least, now this is 15, 20 years ago, but I would have folks that, were all up in the 25-year, range. They've been working for the utility. And so I found change management was especially difficult because you had so much mindset. This is the way we've always done it. This is the way this is the only way I don't question it. We do it this way all the time. So was change management something that you have to bring to the table every time?
Always. That's absolutely a core skill when you're looking at these types of things. Anytime you're doing any kind of a transformation, so it's a buzzword. Obviously, people say, "Oh, we need to do a transformation." Great. What does that actually mean? But in this case, when you've had these fundamental supply chain disruptions that are forcing the business to have to do something different, you can't just rely on it being business as usual in the way that we've always done it. So you have to bring change management into it. It helps that it's created a burning platform, and there's no question that platform is on fire, and you have to do something about it because you have to do something different. So that creates a lot of impetus across the organization to reinforce the idea of change, but you're always going to run into it where people don't want to do anything different because change is hard. None of us like to change. We want to keep doing what we've always been doing because it works for us and it's comfortable. But reality shifts and we have to do it differently. And I find that to be one of the most interesting, most rewarding, but most challenging parts of what we do.
At the same time.
Yes.
All at the same time. So in closing, could you just share with folks a little bit about procurability? Because they may not all be aware of what you guys do.
Sure. Absolutely. Thanks for that, Dawn. Yes, Procurability is a procurement services firm. We talk about ourselves about being the one-stop shop for a CPO. So whatever a CPO might need from a professional services provider, we can do for them, whether that's traditional consulting, so looking at sourcing, looking at transformations, organizational design, process design, whatever it happens to be, we can provide those services. At the same time, if you need people, so you need short-term backfill, we have a staffing and recruiting group that can provide that. If you need help finding high-quality talent, which has been a significant problem for everyone over the last couple of years, we have the ability to help you with that as well. Analytics as a service, we have that group that can step in and does some amazing things. And finally, we also provide market intelligence. So whatever a particular CPO needs in order to help to drive the high function of their organization when they see that they're running into any kind of difficulties, we're there to be able to help them and help to backfill and support them in any whatever it was that they need.
Wow, that's great. So folks, if you don't know Joe, you should reach out to him on LinkedIn and make sure he's part of your network. If you don't know Procurability, you should start following them. I've been amazed at your incredible growth over the last few years. So really impressive what you guys are doing. So congratulations to that and keep up the good work. And as always, we'd love having you on the podcast. So I'd love to invite you back, Joe, and get an update from you maybe next year.
Sounds great.
Okay. So folks, it's Joe Adamski, Senior Director of Procurability. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast and make sure to listen in very soon for another one.
Great. Thank you, Don.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe to the Sourcing Industry Landscape podcast through iTunes or your favorite podcast app. Want to nominate yourself or someone else for an interview? Email us at podcast@sig.org.